My name is Lieutenant Colonel Claire Donovan. I've spent 16 years in the Army Medical Corps, 9 of them in combat zones. I've sutured arteries under headlamps, reset bones in the back of a Humvee, and kept men breathing through nights so long you forgot there was a sunrise. I never chased medals. I cared about the first steady breath after chaos, the weight in a soldier's eyes when they realised they'd made it home. But all the years in sand and blood didn't prepare me for the sting of being dressed down in a ballroom by my own brother in front of half the military elite of Washington, D.C. I hadn't been to an event this formal in years, the kind where the carpet feels thicker than your paycheck and every chandelier looks like it could pay off a student loan. The National Wounded Veterans Gala was being held in the ballroom of the Mayflower Hotel, just a few blocks from the White House. Walter Reed, where I'd worked for the past 8 years, was the main rehabilitation partner this year. My name was on the programme not as some kind of hero, but as Lieutenant Cole Claire Donovan, Rehabilitation Liaison, which is military speak for "you're here to talk to rich people, so they'll keep funding us." The truth was, I didn't mind. My patients needed every dollar of support they could get, and I'd learned long ago that healing didn't just happen in hospitals. It happened in moments of dignity connection and sometimes in ballrooms under expensive lights. The lobby smelled faintly of cologne and champagne. Dress blues, evening gowns, polished shoes that probably hadn't seen a day of dirt. I adjusted my own uniform jacket, worn but crisp, and stepped into the main room. The air shifted. It always did when you walked into a place where most people had already decided who you were. That's when I heard him. "Don't act like you're still in the field hospital, Claire." Colin's voice carried just enough to make sure the half circle of officers around him heard. My stepbrother had always been good at that lacing an insult in silk and tossing it just far enough to land in public. He was in his dress, White's medals glinting under the light posture, perfect, like he'd stepped out of a recruiting poster. He looked me up and down, the way you check the weather, mildly curious, but mostly deciding if it's going to ruin your day. A couple of the men beside him smirked. One actually chuckled. I could have said something. God knows I had the material. But years in uniform had taught me that silence can be louder than a comeback. I met his eyes for a beat longer than was comfortable, then stepped past him without a word. The sound in the room swelled again, as if the moment had never happened. Someone handed me a flute of champagne, which I took but didn't sip. I signed my name at the guest check-in table, the gold letters on my name tag catching the light letter Cole. Claire Donovan, Walter Reed, National Military Medical Center. The woman at the desk smiled brightly. "Your table's near the dance floor, Colonel. You'll have a perfect view for the program." Perfect view. I wondered if that meant perfect view of my brother's face later. As I moved toward the table, I caught fragments of conversations, funding proposals, deployment stories, polished for polite company, the occasional whisper about who was here and why. It was the kind of room where everyone wore 2 uniforms, the one on their body and the one made of reputation. I could still feel Colin's words hanging on me like dust. Don't act like you're still in the field hospital. To him, that meant don't pretend you matter as much as I do. Our mother had married his father when I was 14, just after my own dad, an army medic, was killed in a convoy attack outside Basra. Colin had been groomed for command from day one. I'd chosen combat medicine because it was the only way I knew to be close to the kind of work my father had done. Colin saw that as a consolation prize. The irony, of course, was that I'd spent more time near the front lines than he ever had. But medals earned in triage tents didn't sparkle the same way in a ballroom. I found my table and set my champagne down. Across the room, in the far corner, I noticed a man in an army dress uniform sitting alone in a wheelchair. He wasn't talking to anyone. His hands rested loosely on the rim's eyes, scanning the room, like he was half present, half elsewhere. The angle of his shoulders, the stillness, it wasn't just physical. I'd seen that kind of distance before, in patients who weren't ready to rejoin the world yet. From where I stood, I could see the edge of something metallic under the cuff of his trousers. Carbon fibre, a prosthetic leg, and from the way his torso held itself upright, I knew without a shadow of doubt that he could stand if he wanted to. Maybe not for long, maybe not gracefully, but it was there. Colin's laugh broke across the room like a dropped glass. I turned back toward my table. Tonight was supposed to be about the veterans, about the work we did at Walter Reed, about connection. But I could feel the first ember of something else lighting up inside me. I didn't know it yet, but before the night was over, the man in the wheelchair, my brother and I would all be standing in the same circle, and only one of us would leave it unchanged. Colin and I hadn't grown up in the kind of family that left you guessing where you stood. We weren't blood, but we shared a roof from the day my mother married his father. We were a house of rank and rules, where the table was set with good china and quiet judgments, and where the stories told over roast chicken always had a hero and a lesson. The hero was rarely me. Charleston made it easy to wrap your life in tradition. Live oaks leaning over narrow streets' porches, with ceiling fans pushing thick summer air, the stubborn sweetness of iced tea that could glue your teeth together. My mother loved that city the way some people love a hymn. After my father died in Basra, convoy hit no heroics left to perform. She folded our lives back into Charleston like sheets fresh from the line. We stayed near family. We said grace like it was a contract. And eventually, she remarried. Brigadier General Daniel Mercer arrived in a starched uniform and a clean narrative stability, standing a last name that opened doors. With him came his son from a previous marriage, a boy who was all elbows and certainty. Colin didn't knock before entering a room. He just assumed you'd been waiting for him. He was polite in the way people are when they know the room already belongs to them. I was 14, old enough to understand that grief makes you accept things you might have sidestepped in another life. He was 17, already sure of the space he took up in the world. Colin and I shared a hallway and nothing else. He rose early to run the battery. I rose earlier to make coffee for Mom before her shift at the clinic. He practiced salutes in the mirror. I learned how to tape fingers, how to read a fever by the weight of someone's breath. We were both in our own ways training. At dinner, the conversation orbited Colin. Debate team, service, academy dreams, leadership conferences where kids carried clipboards and used the word mission to describe group projects. I didn't mind at first. It felt like balance let the living proof of order and discipline fill the room, while the messy parts of war, the part that took my father, stayed quiet. But there's a drip that happens when you sit under it long enough. It doesn't matter how small the leak is. It will find your patience and hollow it out from the inside. The first time I remember being measured against him in public was at a church picnic behind St. Michael's. They were handing out scholarship certificates to seniors. Colin got one for leadership potential. Mine was for community service. The woman at the microphone smiled at me like I'd been very helpful in the nursery. On the drive home, Mum said, "They see different gifts in you too." She meant it kindly. It still landed like a sorting hat I hadn't asked to wear. When I told them I wanted to follow Dad Army Medical Corps, not the glamorous version, the real thing, Mum pressed her lips together the way she did when something wasn't her decision to fight. Daniel nodded like I'd chosen a respectable cul-de-sac. Colin clapped me on the shoulder. "You'll be great at the supporting cast," he said. There wasn't malice in it. That almost made it worse. I left Charleston for basic with a duffel and a quiet promise I didn't need a stage to be useful. I only needed a job that counted when the lights were off. Years later, in places where the maps were more dust than lines, I learned the rhythm that would become my spine. Headlamps, tourniquets, the heavy calm that has to live in your hands so others can borrow it. I learned how to speak softly to men who'd been taught that pain is a private language. I learned when to call for the bird and when to be the bird. None of it looked like leadership on a brochure. All of it kept people alive. Back in the ballroom, The band was moving through a standard so polished it barely touched the floor. I could still feel the Charleston heat somewhere under my ribs, the way childhood has a climate you never quite adjust from. Colin stood across the room, near a cluster of donors, laughing that easy laugh I'd heard 1,000 times, on porches and parade fields. He had the posture of a man whose shoulders had been given permission to take up space. He turned and our eyes snagged. Not a long look, just enough for me to recognise the expression. Not brother to sister, officer to problem. He lifted his glass in a gesture that could pass for civility. It wasn't. The thing about families like ours is that rank leaks. It seeps out of uniforms and into birthdays, into holidays, into which story gets told first and which name gets said with pride. It decides who carves the turkey and who clears the plates. You can spend years pretending you don't notice. Then, one day, someone cuts you with it in front of a room, and you realise you noticed the entire time. When my mother married Daniel, she traded one kind of uncertainty for another. The new one came with structure, schedules, expectations pressed like creases into every day. Love lived there too, I don't want to lie about that. But it was a love that behaved. Colin thrived in it. I learned to breathe around it. In high school, when he got into the academy, there were banners and a catered sheet cake. When I got my acceptance to a nursing program that fed directly into the army, Mum hugged me long, soft, proud. Then she asked if I'd thought about public health instead, something stable. She didn't mean to say safer. She said it anyway. By the time we were both in uniform, the distance had a name. His promotions announced with print and photos. Mine with late-night calls that ended in "Good work, Donovan," before the line clicked dead. He visited bases as an invited guest. I left them in convoys that didn't guarantee tomorrow. None of that is a complaint. It's a ledger. We were paid in different currencies. He thought his was the only legal tender. A server brushed past me, muttered an apology, and the present tugged me back. I smoothed the corner of my name tag without meaning to. Lieutenant Claire Donovan. Shiny letters that didn't say the quiet parts. The women who had gripped my wrist like it was the last rope on the cliff, the men who learned to trust their bodies again one breath at a time, the nights when the silence after a stabilized pulse felt like church. Across the room, the wheelchair sat like an island with a single inhabitant. He wasn't staring at the dance floor the way lonely people do when they want to be asked. He was looking at exits at distances at his hands. People passed him like furniture, good furniture, polished, respected, not to be touched. The carbon fibre curve under his cuff caught the light again. In the clinic, we call it hardware. In a room like this, it read like a warning label. Charleston taught me that rooms tell you who's allowed to be seen. War taught me what happens when you look away anyway. I felt the old muscle memory of attention settle in. Not pity, recognition. I thought about Dad, about the way he came home from field rotations, with hands that smelled like antiseptic and diesel. He used to sit on the back steps at dusk boots, unthreaded sock lines pressed into his ankles, and he'd listen more than he talked. Once, when I was 10, I told him I wanted to be brave like the soldiers in the stories. He smiled at the yard, not at me. Brave is just staying when it's easier to leave, he said. Most days, that's all it is. I don't know if the man across the room needed me to stay. I only knew I could. The MC tapped a microphone. A hush settled in that isn't really silence, just a coordinated pause. The programme would start soon, speeches of video with swelling strings, the kind of montage designed to make a room reach for wallets and napkins at the same time. I was supposed to want that. I did. But something in me had shifted a degree the moment I clocked the prosthetic. I reached for my champagne, thought better of it, set the glass down untouched. Habit. I like my decisions sober, and my hands empty. Behind me, someone said Colin's name with a laugh attached to it. The sound hit the same place his earlier comment had. Not a wound. a bruise you've learned to carry without flinching. Maybe tonight would be the same as the others. Shake hands, thank donors, leave with a folder of promises to follow up on Monday. Or maybe it would be the kind of night that changes its own weather. I let my gaze return to the man in the wheelchair. His jaw worked once like he was swallowing a thought. He had the posture of someone who used to be very good at standing. The band slid into another standard. The dance floor waited a polished square of permission. No one was using it yet. Maybe I was tired of waiting for permission too. Colin stepped forward onto the edge of the floor with two colonels I recognized from the Pentagon. He gestured toward me with a small tilt of his chin, said something that made both men glance over, then down at their shoes. I could imagine the sentence. I didn't need to hear it. I took one breath, then another. The kind you take before cutting through a crowd or into a chest. And I started walking. Not toward my brother, toward the man everyone else had edited out of the frame. The space between us felt longer than the length of the ballroom. I moved past tables draped in white linen, the air scented faintly with champagne and starch. Conversations blurred into a low hum, the kind that covers curiosity without committing to it. Jack Porter sat where I'd first noticed him, his wheelchair tucked neatly beneath the table hands, resting loose on the rims as though he had no intention of using them tonight. His uniform was immaculate creases, sharp brass polished, but his eyes were fixed somewhere past the wall, as if there were a window only he could see. I stopped just close enough that he'd have to decide whether to acknowledge me. "Would you like to dance?" The words landed between us like a coin on a countertop, soft but impossible to ignore. He looked up slowly, measuring my face, my posture, maybe my nerve. I didn't move. I didn't offer a hand. My father used to say, the first thing you give a wounded soldier back is agency. After a moment, Jack leaned back just enough to push his chair away from the table. The faint whir of the wheels over carpet drew a few glances from nearby tables. Then, with a shift in his shoulders, he set both hands on the armrests and began to rise. It wasn't effortless. His movements were deliberate, bracing against the strain, but there was no hesitation. The carbon fibre prosthetic caught the light as he straightened to his full height. The nearest conversation stuttered, then stalled completely. I heard a fork set down 2 tables over. The band kept playing, but the music felt suddenly closer, as if the rest of the room had leaned in. Jack looked at me, the corner of his mouth lifting. "It's been a while," he said, voice low, almost amused. "Then, let's make it count," I replied. I stepped onto the edge of the dance floor with him, letting him set the pace. His grip was steady, his steps measured. I matched him, neither leading nor following, just moving together in a rhythm that belonged only to us. Around us, the room shifted chairs, turned heads angled. Somewhere in the crowd, I felt Colin's gaze lock on us, sharp and assessing. Jack's focus stayed on me. His breathing was even, but I could see the effort in the set of his jaw. "You don't even know, do you?" he murmured almost to himself. I caught his words, but didn't ask. There was something in his tone that told me the answer wasn't meant for this moment. We made a slow turn, the hem of my uniform skirt brushing the polished floor, his prosthetic making the faintest tap each time it touched down. It wasn't the kind of dance that drew applause for skill, but the kind that drew silence for meaning. We reached the far side of the floor, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the entire Gala had been reduced to a circle the size of our steps. Jack's hand tightened just slightly on mine, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition maybe, or the first edge of a story he hadn't told yet. Then the music ended. There was a pause before the applause came, scattered, but genuine, the kind that acknowledged not performance, but presence. Jack inclined his head to me. "Thank you, Colonel." Any time I said meaning it more than he knew. As we stepped off the floor, I caught sight of Colin. He was still in his cluster of donors, but his expression had cooled into something flat and unreadable. For the first time that evening, he wasn't the one holding the room. Jack returned to his chair without ceremony, adjusting the cuffs of his trousers as if nothing had happened. I let my hand rest briefly on the back of his chair before moving toward my table. The applause had faded, the conversations resumed, but a subtle shift lingered in the air. I knew enough about nights like this to recognize when something had started, even if no one could name it yet. What I didn't know was that this was the first step toward the 10 words that would change everything. I heard the shift in the room before I saw him. It was subtle at first, a change in the pitch of conversations, the way people straightened their spines, a ripple moving through the crowd like wind over tall grass. Then, the double doors opened wider, and General Thomas Porter stepped in. Even in a room thick with brass, he stood apart. His dress uniform carried more than medals. It carried authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced. Shoulders, square gaze, steady, the faintest trace of dust at the hem of his trousers, as if he'd come straight from somewhere that mattered more than a ballroom. People moved instinctively to make space as he crossed the floor. I'd seen generals before, but there was something about Porter that pulled focus without demanding it. His eyes scanned the room once, and then he walked with unbroken purpose toward the far corner, toward Jack. Jack's posture changed as soon as he saw him, not into the stiff formality most officers would assume, but into something quieter, looser recognition. Porter reached him, rested a hand on his son's shoulder with the easy claim of a father. The air between them wasn't for public display, it was layered with years of unspoken history. I froze mid-step, the connection hitting me a second later. Jack Porter. Thomas Porter. I'd just danced with the son of the most respected general in the army. Across the room, Colin had noticed too. His smile sharpened the kind of expression he wore when he scented opportunity. I could almost see him rehearsing whatever he'd say to make himself central to this scene. But Porter's gaze didn't seek him out. In fact, as the general's eyes moved over the crowd, they slid right past Colin as though he was part of the wallpaper. Jack said something I couldn't hear, his voice pitched low. Porter listened, then turned his head toward me. The effect was immediate. My breath stalled, the noise around us dimmed, and for a heartbeat, it felt like we were the only 2 people standing in the ballroom. He released Jack's shoulder and started walking toward me. Each step was deliberate, cutting a straight line through the space between us. People shifted out of his way, their conversations evaporating. By the time he stopped in front of me, the surrounding circle had gone quiet enough to hear the faint clink of glassware at the bar. Up close, his presence was even heavier, but not oppressive. It was the weight of someone who carried both responsibility and memory. His eyes locked on mine, steady and assessing. And then his voice, low and resonant, rolled into the silence. "Colonel, you once saved my son's life in Mosul." 10 words. Simple, factual, but they landed like a detonation. I felt them ripple outward through the crowd. Heads turned. The hush deepened. Somewhere behind Porter, Colin went utterly still. A murmur started at one table and moved like smoke across the room. Mosul. The word carried its own weight. For those who knew, it wasn't just a place, it was a chapter, written in blood and heat and dust. Porter didn't look away as he extended his hand. I took it, the memory flashing without permission, the collapsed market, the metal taste in the air, the boy Jack pale from blood loss, his breath hitching in my ear as I told him to keep his eyes open, to listen to my voice, to not go anywhere until I said so. I hadn't known his name then. I'd known only that he was mine to keep alive, until someone else could take over. Porter's grip was firm, not crushing. Gratitude lived in it, but so did understanding. He knew exactly what those hours in Mosul had cost. "My family owes you more than we can repay," he said softer now, just for me. I didn't answer right away. My mind was still trying to reconcile the man I'd steadied on the dance floor with the young soldier I'd pulled from under rubble years ago. Over Porter's shoulder, I saw Colin. His expression had collapsed into something flat, unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw gave him away. This wasn't his stage anymore. Porter released my hand, gave a small nod, and returned to Jack. The circle of quiet loosened conversations, slowly picking back up though the undercurrent had changed. Eyes followed me now, not with curiosity, but with something closer to respect, or maybe reconsideration. Jack met my gaze over his father's shoulder. There was the faintest curve to his mouth, like he'd been waiting for this to happen, like he knew it would. And maybe deep down, so had I. The ballroom was still around me, crystal lights glinting off glassware, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. General Porter's words hung in the air, 10 of them each heavy enough to pull me backward in time. The clink of cutlery and the low hum of conversation dissolved, replaced by a deep, concussive boom that rattled my ribs. The smell hit neck smoke, hot metal dust, so thick it scraped the back of my throat. Mosul, 2016. I'd been moving with a small convoy through the market when the first IED went off. Crowds scattered, screaming, the air flashing white before the sound caught up. We'd just gotten our bearings when the second blast collapsed the west wall of the market. Masonry steel beams and wooden stools came down in a single choking wave. I didn't remember falling, just the impact then, the pressure of debris pinning my legs. The air was dim, with dust turning every breath into work. Somewhere nearby, a man was groaning low, ragged, the kind of sound that made you check how much morphine you had left. Medic. The voice was hoarse, but alive. I turned my head and found him a soldier, younger than I'd expected, uniform, torn right leg, gone just above the knee. Blood soaked the ground beneath him, dark and too fast. He was pale already, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the air. Training takes over when thought is too slow. My hands were moving before my mind caught up tourniquet high and tight twist until the bleeding stopped, pressure dressing layered in morphine ampule between my teeth to snap it open. He hissed when I injected it, but didn't pull away. Name I asked, needing him to stay with me. Porter, he said, then swallowed. Jack. His breathing was fast, shallow, a drumbeat I needed to slow. I kept talking about nothing and everything. What's your hometown, favourite meal, first car? He tried to answer, voice slurring, but every word was a small victory. Overhead, the creak of shifting debris reminded me that we were far from safe. I tried the radio static, then nothing. The second blast had knocked out comms. No one knew we were here. Hey, Jack, I said, forcing my voice calm. We're going to be here a while. You stay with me, you hear? You don't get to leave until I say so. His eyes found mine, scared, but listening. The hours that followed felt both endless and compressed. Dust settled on our faces, on my gloves, turning everything grey. My knees went numb under the weight of concrete, but I couldn't shift without risking collapse. I checked his tourniquet every few minutes, adjusted his position to keep circulation in the rest of his body. I made him talk about his mom, his brother, the fishing trip he'd taken when he was 12. When his answers got too slow, I told him about Charleston summers, about the way the air smelled before a storm, about the iced tea my mother made that could glue your teeth together. Anything to keep him anchored. Once he asked if we were going to make it out. I didn't lie. We're going to stay alive until we do. Around the third hour, his teeth began to chatter, not from cold, but from shock. I peeled off my outer jacket, draped it over him, kept my hands on his shoulder to let him feel a pulse that wasn't his own. My voice got hoarse from talking, but silence was the real enemy. Every minute without rescue was a minute closer to losing him. Finally, faint at first, came the sound. Metal, striking metal, muffled shouts, the bark of orders. I yelled back until my throat burned. light knifed through a gap above us as hands tore away debris. The first face I saw was smeared with soot, eyes wide. "Two," here they shouted. They got to Jack first, lifting him onto a stretcher with the kind of speed that comes from knowing the clock is almost out. He was slipping under, so I leaned close. "You stay with them, Jack. You stay." He didn't answer, but his fingers twitched once against mine before they carried him away. They pulled me free, neck's leg screaming as blood returned. I wanted to watch where they took him, to make sure he made it all the way, but another blast in the distance sent everyone moving. Minutes later, I was back at the aid station, treating the next wave. There's no pause button in a war zone. That night, when it was finally quiet, I sat on the back steps of the tent hospital, the smell of antiseptic clinging to me. Somewhere in the city, a young soldier named Jack Porter was alive. That had to be enough. But I made a promise right there, under a strip of desert sky, no one I found would ever wait for rescue alone again. The memory thinned the sound of the ballroom, easing back in like a tide returning. I was still standing in front of General Porter, the echo of Mosul in my chest. Jack was a few feet away, watching me like he knew exactly where I'd just been. And maybe he did. General Porter moved on, swallowed by a half circle of handshakes and polished smiles, and Jack stayed where he was, the quiet in his eyes saying more than anything he might try to say out loud. He knew where I'd just been, because he'd been there with me under that weight and dust, and for a moment the ballroom felt honest. It didn't last. I sensed Colin before I saw him. The shift in the air that always came when he decided to occupy a space. He arrived with a smile too thin to be called polite. "Quite a scene," he said, voice pitched low for me, and loud enough for anyone hovering close. "Let's not let a field incident from years ago turn into mythology." I kept my face neutral. A soldier lived. That's not mythology. His eyes flicked toward Jack, then back to me. "Make sure you keep your head down, Claire. Tonight's plenty." He didn't wait for my answer. He never did. He moved off toward a senator and a defense contractor. I recognized his posture loosening as he stepped into a conversation that would never include me. The rest of the program blurred past the awards, the video with the strings, the applause that hit the right beats, and none of the nerve. I congratulated the honorees, shook donors' hands, and left before dessert. When I got home, I washed ballroom air off my skin and tried to sleep. I didn't. Morning came with a subject line that landed like a fist. Program realignment urgent. The email was from a deputy assistant at DoD I'd met twice, always in rooms where you could tell who was in charge without reading the nameplates. The message was crisp and bloodless. Effective immediately, Phase 2 mobility training for wounded. Transition cohort will be repositioned to the Mid-Atlantic Rehabilitation Consortium. Please prepare transfer summaries for active cases by close of business Friday. It was Tuesday. I read it twice. Then I checked the CC line. Sitting there like a fingerprint left on a doorknob was a major general who'd mentored Colin. I felt heat move up my neck. Realignment is the word you use when you want to sound neutral about a decision that isn't. I opened my calendar. 23 patients in Phase 2, 17 of them scheduled for next week milestones we'd been building toward for months. You can't just lift a person's progress and move it across town like a file. Bodies don't hand themselves over because a memo says so. I called the coordinator listed in the email. She sounded apologetic and immovable, a combination I've learned to mistrust. "The consortium has capacity," she said, "and excellent outcomes." "I'm familiar with their outcomes," I said. "I also know we've tailored these plans to soldiers who trust the team they're working with. You can't quantify that on a spreadsheet. The decision's above my pay grade." "Whose pay grade is it a pause?" "The evaluation committee. You'll be receiving a request later today." She was right. Just before lunch, a second email arrived, flagged high priority. Program effectiveness, review, action required. It attached a 14-page rubric packed with metrics that looked reasonable, until you notice the timelines attached to them, 30-day windows, for outcomes that take 90-day evaluations, for adaptations that often need 6 months. There were sections weighted heavily toward budget utilization and cost per outcome efficiency, which is a tidy way of saying what's the cheapest version of better you can deliver. At the bottom, lead auditor, Brig, Jenner's Daniel Mercer Ritotten Consulting Oversight. My hands went still on the keyboard. Daniel, of course. Real power doesn't need to announce itself, it just signs the bottom of the page. I walked to the window of my office and watched 2 of our patients circle the track outside, one with a carbon fibre leg and a gait you could set a metronome to the other, with a tremor that calmed after the second lap, always after the second. I thought about the word efficiency and wondered if anyone in that committee had ever paid attention to a man finding his balance again. Before I could decide whether to scream or laugh, Erin knocked and slipped in. Lieutenant Erin Blake had a way of entering a room like she'd been invited by the air. "You saw it?" she asked. I turned the screen. She whistled low. "They're not even subtle." "They don't have to be," I said. "Subtlety is for people who think they can be stopped." She leaned against the door, studying my face. "What do you want me to do, triage?" I said. "We move what we can up. Double up sessions for anyone close to a breakthrough within safe limits. Document everything. If they want numbers, we'll give them numbers with context. And the transfers, not yet." We push back through clinical necessity. Nobody moves mid-protocol without a medically sound transition plan signed by me. Erin nodded, a spark in her eye I recognised from the first day we worked together. "Got it. Also, word in the halls is that the General's kid Porter's kid was at the gala. With you." "He danced," I said, and left it at that. The afternoon stretched thin, calls, paperwork, sessions I refused to cancel. I adjusted a brace, watched an ankle wake up, listened to a man rehearse the first phone call he planned to make to his daughter, without apologising for who he was now. Between appointments, I paged through the audit rubric, annotating every line with what it would miss if applied without context. By 5, my inbox held 2 more messages from the oversight office asking for preliminary data. By 6, I had 3 voicemails from patients worried about being shipped somewhere new. I returned each one. I told the truth. We were fighting it. The next morning, the second shoe dropped. Finance sent a projection that made my stomach knot if the transfer and the negative weightings from the evaluation landed the way they were written. Our program would lose 28% of its funding next quarter. That's not a haircut. That's a tourniquet applied to the wrong limb. The memo didn't say it, but I could read subtext in military font, "Make yourself smaller," or "Be made smaller." Around noon, a colleague in admin forwarded me a meeting invite. I wasn't supposed to see an off-site alignment discussion between the consortium leads and 2 names that might as well have been a signature the Major General from the CC line and Daniel Mercer. No Colin in text, but I didn't need him to show up on paper to feel his hand on the lever. He'd found the right doorway to press the dignified one where sabotage wears a tie and calls itself stewardship. I walked down to the therapy floor to clear my head, the only way that ever worked by doing the work. Jack was there with Erin, focused sweat tracking a clean line along his jaw. He caught my eye, didn't ask anything, just gave me a nod that landed like a promise. When his set ended, I tightened the lower strap on his prosthetic and asked, "How's the socket holding?" "Better," he said. "Trust is catching up to the hardware." He studied my face. "You okay?" "We're under review," I said. "They want to move phase 2 to Mark." He exhaled through his nose. "Because of last night." "Because of a lot of nights," I said. He glanced toward the windows, where sunlight made a bright rectangle on the mat. "What do you need?" The question was simple and disarming. Most people offer advice. The ones you can count on offer hands. "Show up," I said. "Do the work. Let me worry about the rest." He nodded once. "Then, that's what I'll do." By evening, the day had carved itself into a series of small resistances, a form revised to say what it actually needed to say, a schedule shuffled to protect progress that didn't show up on the audit's timeline, a call placed to a physical therapist at Mark. I trusted setting terms for any transition that might be inevitable, which is not the same as acceptable. When the building thinned out and the automatic lights started deciding which hallways deserved illumination, I stood in my doorway and looked out at the empty floor. The parallel bars, the cones, the stack of weighted vests, quiet now holding the day's echoes. There's a temptation in moments like this to make speeches to no one. I didn't. I walked back to my desk and opened a clean document. I titled it Context Addendum, and I started writing what the rubric would never ask the names of patients ready to attempt stairs for the first time. The days of week pattern for a Marine whose pain spiked on Thursdays, because that's when his wife's shift left him alone longer. The way Erin's voice dropped half a note for soldiers who flinched at loud instructions. The fact that outcomes measured at 30 days will always be worse if you move a man on day 29. I wrote until my wrists ached. When I finally closed the laptop, the window showed only my reflection and a slice of the night beyond. I thought of Colin, how he'd lifted his glass at the Gala like a benediction for people who belonged. How easily he'd stepped into the machinery this morning and turned the crank. He wanted a public defeat, a clean realignment, the kind that leaves no fingerprints and no headline. He'd get a fight instead, but not the kind he expected. I locked the office and stood for a minute in the dark, listening to the building breathe. If he was going to force me smaller, he'd have to try harder. I'd learned in other rooms under other roofs how to hold a line when the ground was already moving. I didn't need a stage. I needed time proof and a door I could wedge open with the one thing bureaucracy fears most. The truth arranged carefully enough that no one could shove it back into a drawer. I went home, slept like a field cot, brief and enough. In the morning, I'd brief my team call legal and start stacking facts into something that could carry its own weight across a hostile table. If Colin wanted to test how much of me was performance, he'd find out I work best when no one is watching. The next morning, Walter Reed was still wrapped in that early hour quiet, the kind that smells faintly of antiseptic and yesterday's coffee from the staff lounge. I came in earlier than usual, not out of ambition, but because I needed the silence to stitch together my counterattack. The context addendum file was already open on my laptop, the cursor blinking like it was tapping its foot at me. I'd braced myself for a morning buried in the shadow work of data and bureaucratic jargon. Then I heard a soft chime. New email. At first I meant to ignore it, but my eyes caught on the sender's name and my fingers froze. Sophie Grant. The name spread across my mind like spilled ink, carrying with it the smell of red wine and roasted chicken from family dinners long past. Sophie had been Colin's wife until she vanished from every guest list, every Christmas photo without a word. People whispered about Europe. Others said she just wanted to escape the weight of the uniform. But I remembered her differently, quiet, observant, her eyes always taking measurements no one else noticed. I opened the email. The first line was, "Just I saw you at the Gala. You haven't changed." Beneath it, "I know what he's doing to you and I can prove it." Attached were a PDF and several scanned images. My pulse slowed the way it does when you're trying to hear something in the distance. The first few pages were minutes from an internal Department of Defense meeting. Colin's name appeared again and again linked to proposed resource reallocation, a polite term for stripping Walter Reed of key rehabilitation contracts. The next set of pages showed emails between Colin and a general he clearly trusted, discussing a transition phase and media framing to minimise blowback. The final document was a budget projection for post-LD transition. I didn't need to ask who LD was. Then came the scan that stopped me cold, Colin's handwriting in bullet points. 3 steps. 1. Move key patients to the new facility. 2. Reassess recovery metrics using altered criteria. 3. Install the right replacement. I leaned back in my chair trackpad, under my fingers, but unmoving. How long had Sophie been holding on to this, and why now? At the bottom of her email she'd written, "He doesn't just want you gone, Claire. He wants everything you've built to vanish." I believed him too long. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. My mind flashed to Sophie in my mother's kitchen, the smell of roast chicken filling the hall. Colin telling some story about a medal ceremony, while Sophie silently chopped vegetables, her lips pressed thin. Back then, I thought she was just tired. Now, I knew she was counting the days. I saved all the files to an encrypted USB drive, the kind with a physical lock, and printed a hard copy. As the pages slid warm from the printer, I folded them once and slipped them into a cardboard file sleeve. The paper was cool by the time I held it, but the weight in my hand felt like ammunition. I didn't know what Sophie expected me to do with this, but I knew I wouldn't waste it. My eyes drifted to the rehabilitation map pinned on the wall, dotted with the hometowns and bases of every patient who'd made it back to a full life. In my mind, a new red mark appeared, not where someone had been saved, but where I would strike back. "You just gave me my first bullet, Sophie," I said under my breath. And for the first time in weeks, I knew exactly which way I was facing. And for the first time in weeks, I knew exactly which way I was facing. I poured everything into the work. No speeches, no politics, just the daily grind of helping men and women claw their way back to themselves. Mornings at Walter Reed started before sunrise. The hallways smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, a combination I'd come to think of as the scent of resilience. Lieutenant Erin Blake met me every day in the therapy wing. She was younger than most of our patients, sharp-eyed, and carried herself like every second mattered. She'd been through 2 tours before a roadside bomb put her here. "She doesn't guide, she follows Erin," said to a new patient one morning as we walked into the rehab gym. "But that's what makes us move." I caught the words, but I didn't react. You learn not to make a big deal out of compliments in a place where the real victories are measured in inches and breaths. Jack was one of those victories in progress. He'd been showing up every day, pushing through the pain and the boredom and the moments where frustration tried to take over. We worked on balance, on getting his stride, even with the carbon fibre leg. He'd curse sometimes, grin other times, but he kept going. That's the thing about recovery, there's no applause between steps. One afternoon, I found him staring at the treadmill like it had just insulted him. "It's not the machine," he said when I asked. "It's the idea of moving forward and staying in the same place." I got on the treadmill next to him, matched his speed. "Sometimes forward isn't about distance," I said. "It's about the fact you're still moving." He didn't answer right away, but his pace steadied. Those were the moments that mattered. Between patient sessions, I buried myself in reports, grant proposals, anything that could keep the program alive. Colin's manoeuvring had stripped away so much fewer contracts, fewer patients, more red tape. But the people who stayed were committed. We made do with what we had. I stopped checking for my brother's name in emails or hearing his voice in meetings. Let him play his game. I had my own to win. Weeks passed like that. Small progress. Quiet victories, the kind that didn't make headlines, but rebuilt lives piece by piece. And every so often Jack would say something that reminded me of that night at the Gala, when he'd stood up faster than either of us expected. "If you hadn't believed I could, I wouldn't have," he said once while we were working on stair exercises. "You didn't just help me stand, you made me want to." I didn't have an answer for that. It sat with me longer than I wanted to admit. Erin was right, I didn't guide so much as walk beside them. But maybe that was the point. In the military, we talk a lot about leadership from the front. Out here in recovery, leadership was sometimes about matching someone's pace until they realised they could walk ahead of you. By the end of the month, Jack was moving better than the charts predicted. He'd joke about dancing again, then catch himself and get serious. There was something else in his eyes, like he'd decided there was more left to fight for. I didn't ask what. Everyone in that gym had their own reasons, and not all of them were meant to be shared. One Friday afternoon, as the light slanted through the tall windows and the day wound down, Erin caught me by the coffee machine. You know, she said you've been pushing harder since the gala, like you're not just saving the program, you're proving something. I thought about that. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was proving it to myself as much as to anyone else. Or maybe it was about showing that no amount of politics could erase what we'd built here. Either way, the work went on. And in the quiet rhythm of rehab sessions, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Stability, not the kind my stepbrother measured in rank and ceremony, but the kind you could stand on even when everything else shifted. That was the thing about facing the right way. You didn't have to know exactly where the road ended. You just had to keep walking. Monday morning came with the kind of grey sky that makes you want to stay in uniform just to feel grounded. My inbox had a single new message from the Department of Defense summons to a meeting at the Pentagon. No subject line fluff, no explanation, just a time, a room number, and my name in bold. You just had to keep walking, I told myself again, even as the knot in my stomach tightened. The Pentagon's E-Ring conference room was one of those spaces designed to make you feel both important and very, very small. Long, polished table flags in perfect symmetry walls that seemed to absorb sound. When I stepped in, Colin was already there, stationed at the head of the table, like he'd been born, for it flanked by two colonels I recognised from the gala. His posture was the same as always, shoulders squared. Chin slightly lifted, but there was an extra shine to his eyes, the kind you see when someone thinks they're holding the winning card. The room filled quickly. Generals, senior advisors, a handful of civilians in dark suits. I nodded to a few I knew. Most didn't nod back. Colin cleared his throat, and the low hum of side conversations died. We're here to discuss the after-action review of FOB Lima 2017. He began clicking a remote to bring up a slide on the wall. My chest tightened at the name. He didn't look at me, not once. His voice was smooth, rehearsed the way it had been at every leadership conference since we were kids. The incident resulted in multiple casualties, structural loss, and a breakdown in command and control. He tapped the slide, bringing up bullet points that framed me as a medic who abandoned protocol, failed to await orders, and took unnecessary risks that compromised the mission. The way he said it, you'd think I'd been some reckless rookie trying to play hero instead of a field medic trying to stop people from bleeding out. I felt the eyes in the room shift toward me, some skeptical, some already leaning toward his side. I stayed still, hands folded on the table, letting him dig the hole he was so sure would bury me. He brought up a redacted radio transcript, conveniently cutting out entire exchanges, leaving just enough to make me sound insubordinate. The precision of it was almost impressive if it weren't my career and reputation he was dismantling. I could feel the temperature in the room drop with every slide he advanced. And then, just as he seemed to be closing in on his final point, the door opened. A woman in navy khakis stepped in the sunlight from the hallway, catching the scar along her jaw. Captain Laura Hayes. She moved with a slight limp one I remembered from the rubble at Lima, but her eyes were steady sharp. Colin faltered for half a beat before regaining his voice. Captain Hayes, this is a closed. It is, she said, setting a folder on the table, but you're leaving out a few details, Colonel. The way she said Colonel was the verbal equivalent of slamming a door. All eyes turned to her. She didn't ask permission to speak. She just did. FOB Lima was under sustained mortar fire for 90 minutes. The command post was hit. Medical was hit. Most of us were pinned in sectors with zero cover. She opened the folder, sliding out a series of grainy photographs, collapsed walls, twisted rebar, a sky choked with dust. Lieutenant College Donovan took shrapnel to the shoulder in the first 10 minutes. She stayed in the hot zone to pull me and two other soldiers out from under a collapsed storage unit. She treated us in the open under fire because the aid station was gone. Her voice didn't waver, but mine caught somewhere in my chest. I remembered the blood hers mine everyone's mixing with the grit. She coordinated with air support and engineering to clear a landing zone for medevac. The only reason we have survivors to debrief is because she didn't follow your precious protocol, Laura said, looking straight at Colin now. Murmurs rippled down the table. Colin opened his mouth, but one of the generals at the far end raised a hand. Let her finish. Laura pulled out a small battered radio. This is the comms recording from that day, not the redacted one, the real one. She pressed play. The room filled with static, then my voice steady clipped calling in positions, requesting supply drops, instructing teams to rotate wounded to the evac point. Then another voice, Colin's telling me to hold position until further orders. Then mine again, cutting him off negative. We move now, or we don't move at all. The tape ended in silence. A different kind of silence than before, the kind that shifts the air. The general, who'd stopped Colin earlier, leaned back in his chair, eyes on me. It appears, Colonel Mercer, that your summary was selective? Colin's jaw flexed. He looked like a man who'd just realised the room had stopped listening to him. I didn't move, didn't smile, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Laura closed her folder and slid it toward me. For your records, she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. Some of us never forgot. The meeting ended without a vote, without a verdict, but the current had changed. I could feel it. People left in clusters, some stopping to shake my hand, others glancing at Colin as if he'd grown a second head. He was gone before I stood up. Laura stayed long enough to squeeze my shoulder, then she was gone too. I walked out into the Pentagon courtyard, the sun breaking through the grey just enough to cast long, clean shadows. You just had to keep walking. 3 weeks later, I was walking again, this time across the training field at the Department of Defense headquarters. Washington had slipped into that bright, clean autumn that makes even concrete look honest. It was Veterans Recognition Week, and Walter Reed had been asked to run a live demonstration search and extraction under simulated collapse casualty carries team mobility drills. It wasn't a performance to me, it was proof. We set up at dawn. Engineers erected a low maze of plywood walls, rebar cages, and a rubble pit filled with broken brick and foam blocks that looked meaner than they were. I laid out tourniquets, splints, soft stretchers marking tape. Erin checked comms, then walked the course herself, her fingers brushing each obstacle like a pianist testing keys. Jack arrived with the first wave of patients. He wore a standard PT uniform brace snug over the carbon fibre socket, a look in his eyes that said, "Today mattered." "You running this like a graduation?" he asked. "I'm running this like a beginning," I said. "You don't need permission to start." He nodded once, and that was enough. The small crowd that gathered along the rope line was a mixed chorus uniform suits, families with kids who liked loud trucks and sirens. A few reporters hovered, careful not to get in the way of anything real. I keyed my radio and started the first rotation. "Alpha team, you're on the rubble pit. Bravo, casualty carry. Charlie, mobility lane." The field came alive. A Marine with a tremor managed a steady crawl through a rebar tunnel, his breath counting time. A young lieutenant without a left hand clipped into a drag strap and pulled a weighted dummy 3 yards farther than last week. 2 older vets who'd never met before fell into a rhythm so clean it looked practiced, taking turns as spotter and mover, like they'd been squad mates for years. We kept it moving. No speeches. Corrections were short and quiet. Lower your hips. Check his airway again. You've got 1 more inch in you. On my third pass by the rubble pit, Erin caught my sleeve and flicked her eyes upward. I followed her line to the second-floor balcony of the main building. A man in a dark suit had stepped out into the light forearms on the rail. Even from here I knew the stance. Colin. He'd come out the way people do when they hear noise they think belongs to someone else. He wasn't alone. 2 defence staffers stood a few feet back, but after a moment they faded into the doorway, leaving him at the rail with the field spread under him like a map he couldn't quite read. I didn't look up again. He wasn't the point. We ran the second evolution harder. I moved with the teams instead of standing off with a whistle. I spotted knees, reset grips, took a corner of a stretcher when a shoulder burned out and handed it back when the muscle caught up. The rule was simple. We go together or we don't go. Jack's turn on the rubble pit drew a small hush without anyone meaning to make one. He eased into the broken brick slope with a cautious confidence I hadn't seen in him a month ago, testing the give under his prosthetic, finding the angle that let the carbon blade bite and hold. Halfway in, the drag strap snagged. He paused, jaw working. I didn't step in. I crouched 2 yards away and pointed with 2 fingers, the way we do when words recruit doubt. He adjusted, shifted weight, and the strap came free. Clear left, he said out loud to himself, then to the teammate behind him. Clear right, came the answer. They moved again. At the top of the pit, Jack bent and clipped the strap to the dummy's harness. His face was grey with effort, but the set of his mouth was pure, stubborn grace. He leaned back, legs wide, and the dummy slid one rough foot. Then another. He didn't look up until the last drag carried clear of the yellow tape. When he did, he found me first, not the crowd. I didn't smile. I tapped 2 fingers to my temple and then to my chest, mind, body, our simple shorthand for "you did that." Erin whooped. The crowd answered a messy human sound. Somewhere above, a hinge squeaked softly on the balcony. The last station was a timed carry over a low wall into a tight alley. Not pretty by design. People don't come home whole. They come home ready. I put a wheelchair team on it, 1 seated vet, 1 ambulatory cord clipped between them. We'd practiced a dozen versions of this, the seated partner, calling pace the walking partner, doing the lift at the lip and the pull on the far side. Today, the seated vet was a woman who prefers to be called Val and doesn't like anyone narrating her strength. Calls are yours, I said, and stepped back. They cleared the wall in 2 moves so efficient that onlookers missed it until the wheels touched down. When they rolled into the alley, they both laughed the quick, surprised laugh people make when joy sneaks up on them from the direction of work. I could feel the shift spread along the rope line. Someone clapped out of time and didn't stop. A kid said, "Whoa," like a prayer. A contractor in a badge tried to pretend his eyes weren't wet and failed. On the balcony, Colin hadn't moved. From this angle, I could see only the line of his jaw and the hard set of his shoulders. There was no applause from up there. There didn't need to be. He was seeing what I wanted everyone to see, that the metrics they loved to polish were the least interesting part of the story. That dignity is a skill you rebuild like a muscle, and once it grows, it is loud without raising its voice. We reset the course and ran it again. The second pass went faster. An older vet who hated being watched let Erin stand in front of him and count breaths until his hands stopped shaking. Then he did the carry anyway. A 19-year-old who'd been convinced he'd never work a ladder again stepped up and took the first rung with the focus of a man building a house he planned to live in. I checked my watch, then keyed my radio. Final evolution, I said. Full course. We ran all stations at once. The field turned into a moving sentence, subjects and verbs, no adjectives wasted. People stumbled, corrected, learned out loud. When the last team cleared the last tape and the horn sounded done, the cheer wasn't for winners. It was for finishers. I let it break over us, then lifted my hand for quiet. Debrief in 10, I said to the participants, because debriefs are where truth gets written into the body. As they broke for water, I let myself look up at the balcony. Colin was still there. For a beat, our eyes met across the distance. There was no smirk waiting, no polished line about efficiency or alignment. If anything shifted on his face, it was too small to register from the field. But he didn't look away. He stayed like a man who had come to see something else and accidentally seen what was actually there. Then he pushed off the rail and vanished back into the building, the door whispering shut behind him. I didn't follow with my gaze. I pointed at the rubble pit. "What did you learn?" I asked the circle gathered there. Jack answered before anyone else could. "That sometimes the strap isn't stuck," he said. "You're just pulling from the wrong angle." A few heads nodded. Erin scribbled it down on the whiteboard, because around here we collect sentences that can rescue you on bad days. I stood in the middle of that dusty, bright rectangle of ground and knew the world hadn't changed in any way a memo could capture. But something had moved. Maybe not in the building behind me. Maybe not on the balcony. In us. In me. Quiet revolutions don't come with parades. They arrive like breath you didn't know you were holding until it leaves you clean. Quiet revolutions don't come with parades. They arrive like breath you didn't know you were holding until it leaves you clean. I was still catching mine as we packed up the rescue gear, stowing stretchers and folded tarps, the hum of conversation around us, warm and light. Erin was laughing with two of the newer guys, one of them still flushed from the exertion, the other cradling a paper cup of coffee like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. The crowd on the sidewalk hadn't thinned yet. Donors, Pentagon, staff, a few curious passers-by who'd stopped when they heard the sirens and shouting earlier, now leaning in for photos and handshakes. I was half turned toward the supply cart when I caught sight of Jack moving through the small knot of people. He wasn't in his chair, and the cane at his side looked more like an accessory than a crutch. There was a steadiness to his step now that hadn't been there at the gala. He came up to me with that easy smile he'd picked up somewhere between field drills and hospital corridors. "You did good work today, Colonel," he said, and for a second I thought he meant the logistics, the leadership. But his eyes told me different. First time I felt like I was actually back in the game since that market in Mosul. I shook my head. "You did that yourself, Jack. I just gave you the space." He tilted his head like he wasn't buying it, then glanced over at the small stage that had been set up for the day's announcements. The MC was still there, scanning the crowd for anyone important enough to thank twice. Jack excused himself with a nod and crossed to the stage, leaning in to say something low. A moment later, the MC tapped the mic, and the chatter softened to a ripple. Before we wrap up, the MC said, "Lieutenant Jack Porter has a few words." Jack took the microphone, turning it slowly in his hands like he was choosing the exact weight of what came next. "Some of you were at the National Wounded Veterans Gala a while back," he began, and I felt my shoulders stiffen. That night, I was sitting in a chair I thought I'd never leave. And then someone walked across the room and asked me to dance. A murmur rolled through the crowd. I said I didn't think I had the legs for it. She said she'd seen me stand before and we'd figure the rest out together. And because she believed I could, I did. He looked straight at me. If she didn't believe I could stand, I wouldn't have believed it myself. The words hung there, simple but heavy. And before I could think about it, the MC was saying my name. Jack extended a hand toward me, and the crowd parted like a slow-moving tide. I wanted to wave it off to stay in the comfort of the background, but the faces watching weren't asking for a performance, they were asking to share in something. My boots felt heavier than they should have as I stepped forward, the applause coming up around me like surf. On stage, Jack took my hand and lifted it, high the way fighters do when they've made it through the last round. Today wasn't just a drill, he said into the mic. It was proof that sometimes all we need is someone to take that first step with us. Claire Donovan took that step for me. And for a lot of people here, she's been taking it for years. I could feel the flush in my cheeks, the strange vulnerability of letting someone else carry the narrative. But for once, I didn't mind the spotlight, not when it was being used to shine on all of us. Cameras clicked, the crowd clapped, and for the first time in a long while, I let someone else lead. The applause followed me down the steps of the stage, spilling into the corners of the ballroom, like the echo of something I wasn't ready to name. The lights felt softer now, the faces less sharp. Jack caught my arm as I passed his grip, warm and steady. "See you at Walter Reed next week, Colonel," he said with a grin that carried its own kind of salute. I told him I'd hold him to it. Outside, Washington had slipped into that blue-gold hour, where the monuments glow like they've been storing sunlight all day. I walked past the hotel's heavy glass doors and let the cool air press against my skin. My shoes clicked against the sidewalk, but the sound felt smaller than the quiet that had taken root inside me. By the time I reached my building in Arlington, the city had folded itself into night. I let myself into the apartment, the lock clicking home, in a way that felt final, almost ceremonial. The space was still and familiar, the faint hum of the fridge, the soft spill of lamplight over the couch, the scent of coffee from the pot I'd forgotten to rinse out that morning. I shrugged off my jacket, hung it on the back of a chair. The weight of my rank insignia pulled slightly at the fabric as it settled. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I wasn't thinking about meetings reports or the slow bleed of resources at Walter Reed. On the top shelf of the bookcase, where the dust had settled in a thin, respectful layer, sat a small wooden box. It was darker than the oak around it, its surface worn smooth by years and handling. My father's box. It had followed me from Charleston to basic training, to billets overseas, to this apartment, where I had never once opened it. The military delivered it with the rest of his effects after Basra boots, watch a folded uniform I still couldn't bring myself to touch. Inside, they'd said were personal items. I hadn't looked. I sat on the couch with the box in my lap, the room narrowing to that one object. My father used to talk about maps, not the kind you use to get from one place to another, but the kind you make yourself marking where you've been, what you've learned, who you've helped. He'd called it his map of victories, though he'd never shown it to me. Not yet, he'd said once when I was 10 and full of questions. It's not finished. Then Basra, and it would never be finished by his hand. The hinges gave a reluctant creak when I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a piece of olive green cloth, was his watch. Military issue. The glass scratched the second hand, still frozen in place. Beside it was a folded piece of paper, edges frayed and corners softened by time. I unfolded it slowly, the smell of paper and dust rising like a faint memory. It was a map. Not of a single place, but a patchwork of towns, bases, and coordinates scattered across multiple deployments. Small red marks dotted the paper, dozens of them. I traced one with my finger and remembered him telling me about a cholera outbreak in a village near Kandahar. Another mark near Fallujah, where he'd once patched up a convoy under fire. Each dot was a life or many lives where he'd made a difference. I spread the map on the coffee table, the paper stubborn against its folds. My eyes caught an empty corner, and without thinking, I stood and went to the desk. In the bottom drawer was a red pen I used for patient charts. I uncapped it and leaned over the map. Kabul, Tikrit, a field hospital outside Jalalabad. I marked them one by one, not his victories, but mine. The young Marine who'd learned to walk again after losing both legs. The reservist who'd gone home in time for his daughter's birth. Jack. I kept going until there was a constellation of red across the paper, old dots mingling with new, like we'd been working on the same mission all along. Somewhere between the marks, I realised I was crying. Not the loud, breaking kind, but the quiet spill that comes when something inside finally sets down its armour. My father's map wasn't just about where he'd been, it was about what he'd chosen to see, who he'd chosen to stand beside. And now it was mine, too. I sat back, pen still in my hand, and thought about Colin. About the look on his face when General Porter had spoken those 10 words. About the years I'd spent measuring myself against a standard that was never meant for me. Maybe he'd never see the value in what I did. Maybe that didn't matter anymore. Some victories didn't belong in ballrooms. They belonged in the quiet, in the stubborn act of showing up again and again when no one was watching. I folded the map carefully, pressing the creases back into place. The watch went on top the weight of it, grounding the paper. I closed the box and set it back on the shelf, but this time I knew what was inside. In the morning, I'd go back to Walter Reed. Jack would come in for his next round of therapy, and I'd remind him that standing was just the beginning. Erin would crack a joke over coffee. Another patient would take their first step, or grip a hand, or laugh without wincing. And I'd be there to mark another dot, even if only in my mind. I leaned back against the couch, the city moving quietly outside my window. My father had been right. You didn't need a stage to make your work count. You just needed to light the way for someone else, even if all they could see was one step ahead. It's not about leading myself out of the dark anymore. It's about lighting the way for someone else.